how is the physical space that you occupy and the environment and the architecture shaping your personality without you realizing it? It's a really tough question to ask, and it's an even tougher one to answer. And this book recommendation for this part of the series might seem like a bit of a rogue choice to begin with, but that's what it's all about. It's understanding how when I think of myself, I can't just understand myself in terms of who I am. I have to also understand it in terms of how other people see me, how people from my past have seen me as well, within my family and within my school and within my culture, but also how that is kept in place and reinforced by society at large overall. So the book recommendation for this is going to be non-places. I'm not going to, although the subheading for this is an introduction to supermodernity, I'm not going to focus on that element of it for this particular video, just to help keep it as simple as possible. But this is something that I hadn't even considered for 30 years of my life, maybe more than that still, because it's just not obvious. It's not an obvious question whatsoever. When I think about myself and I think about my personality, it is also held in place by the systems that are around me. And we have to just consider how abstracted things are now away from where they used to be. Let's take, for example, if I was confused about my identity and I was feeling quite anxious as a person because I didn't feel like I really knew anybody that was around me. Let's take something really, really basic to ground that into practice. Let's say going to the shops. If I was to go to the shop, or let's say 100 years ago, realistically, what I would be doing is I'd be going to a market. And I'd be going to my local market specifically. And I would speak to my greengrocer specifically, who I would know. I'd talk to the butcher. I'd talk to the person selling the fish. I'd talk to everybody that I already know. And I wouldn't just know them as those people that were selling those items. Over time, because it's the same people that I would develop a relationship with, I'd also start to understand who they are. I'd ask and inquire about their families. I'd try to understand how is it that they are situated historically within that area. How is it that they relate to their space around them? Who are those families? What is it that they're motivated towards? What are they scared of? I'm trying to understand their place in history in relation to that area of time. Whereas fast forward, let's say 100 years later, instead of going to the market, I'm going to go to the supermarket instead. And what I'm going to do is, rather than going speaking to a person that I know, that has got a long history of being, let's say, the greengrocer, instead I'm going to go to the supermarket and I'm going to be told what the price is, not by another person, but just by disembodied language. I'm going to read it from a plaque, which will just say, here is the item and here is the price. I will also, rather than actually see another person that is actually selling that item, I will hear maybe a voice over the tannoy, over the machines that are saying, oh, can somebody go to self-service checkout? And when I get there, I don't speak to another person. I am the one who scans that in and I'm the one who pays for it. I've gone through a very human process there without actually seeing another human, without having to actually interact with another human. And if I'm confused about my sense of identity or I'm feeling quite lonely, that process of alienation is just going to be doubled down and compounded over and over and over again. Because at the very least 100 years ago, I could see myself and understand myself in relation to all these people and their roles given my little local community. Whereas now, this one Tesco or Asda or Morrison's or whatever else it might be, I'm not here to say anything negative about any particular supermarket. What's going to happen is instead, so the philosophy of what's happened is that the process and the language has been very disembodied. It's been very abstracted away. So in that process, I don't learn anything about myself. I just feel more and more alienated. I live just on the edge of the Peak District in the UK. It's this absolutely beautiful area. And I can go for a walk out in nature. And if I want to learn more about the place that I'm at, rather than speaking to another person who I recognize on these walks, I could read all the information from a plaque, which will just tell me more about it. Even worse, what is increasingly happening is I can scan a QR code to learn more about the forest that I'm stood next to. I really, really hate QR codes. It's beside the point of this. I'm not going to turn it into a rant, but this is even further abstracted. No longer can I not even speak to another person about the history of a place. Now, not even that board is telling me about the history of a place. Now I need to have technology to access the language that the board would have told me otherwise. And you can start to see how suddenly we've gone from a very real grounded approach to reality to getting further and further away. And the less we are grounded, the less we are physically grounded, no wonder we start to float off into this weird, abstract, alienated state. And that's what Non-Places is all about as a book. It's calling into question my sense of identity based on who it is that I'm around and the spaces that I occupy all around me. It brings on this very, very like confusing and difficult process really overall about when we try to understand who we are. It's so practical when we start to think about it in terms of other books. Like in the previous book in this series, I recommended philosophy as a way of life, and the ancient way of practicing philosophy is much more practical. It's much more grounded. It's trying to understand who I am in relation to other people and what I should automatically do about it. Again, in that same video, as well as in another book in the series, I recommended Pleasure by Alexander Lowen as an antidote to this problem. You can't just think about yourself and understand who you are. You need to have that grounded. You need to have an assimilated personality. It's got to be based on the experiences that you're having, but you've got to be the one that's consciously choosing to have certain amounts of those experiences made valuable to you. And when we start to think about a thing like this, a book like this, we can start to realize actually how much of our life is very abstracted, even all the way down to the process of I'm choosing to read a physical book. That means I've got to sit down or stand up. I can do whatever else I want, but let's say for the sake of this, sit down. And I'm physically holding a book and physically scanning through it. I also like to highlight a lot of things in here as well to be able to come back to. So for example, this book here is uniquely mine. It's got my thoughts in it. It's got my highlights in it. I'm not using technology because the way I would access a screen and the way I would take in information from that screen is very different to how I'd access the exact same information in a very tactile way. The process of sitting down away from technology and with a physical book is very different to accessing literally the same information, but in a disembodied sense. And that's what this is talking about. It's understanding that when we go to a supermarket, there's a very different approach when we start to access language, which is spoken at us rather than with us, like with another person. And we're just being instructed around. It's reducing all of the genuinely human aspects about what it is to be a human and just streamlining it and in an overly mechanical, optimized, efficient way to the point where we then start to maybe think about ourselves. And I've seen this with a lot of people that I work with, is the values that they hold are that they are proud to be very independent, very orderly, very efficient, very dependable, very optimized. These are ways that you would actually describe a machine that is fully functioning. Whereas to be able to describe a human, you might be able to say they're creative, they're adaptable, they've got a much more expansive approach towards life, they're much more spontaneous, they're much more fluid. The approach about how we're trying to understand humanity and describe what it is to be a healthy human is starting to change. And that, I think, especially based on a book like this, is starting to have an impact on how we actually relate to the environment around us, let alone to ourselves as well. So I'm very, very conscious that this video of all the others could come across as a bit of a rant. QR code aside, I'm going to stick with that part. I'm going to double down on that part. I hate QR codes. But the point with all of this is, if you're someone at this point in time who is feeling a little bit confused or alienated, what are you doing in your life? And what are the systems that are in place in your life that is reinforcing that alienation? And how can you make it more human? All the way down to, if let's say you've got a physical practice in place where you go to the gym and you want to become physically fitter, are you still just seeing yourself mechanically in that process? Can you actually learn to be enjoying what it is to be a human that is doing that process from the first person perspective, rather than just reducing yourself down? It's a book like this that calls into question so much, and it's very, very difficult to grapple with, but we've got to, at the very least, settle for asking the right questions, even if we don't necessarily find the right answers. And that will probably be the best summary of what I can do for a book like this, Non-Places, because I myself have got a lot of questions about myself and how I relate to the environment and the architecture around me. And this has really pulled into question all these invisible factors that are constantly around me all the time. I'm suddenly more aware of them. And even if I don't necessarily know what to do about them, at the very least I can see them now. And then as a result of all this, I can now question what it is to be me in relation to all this. I've got much more choice in that case, at the very, very least. So I know out of all the books in this series that I've recommended so far, this is probably the most ambiguous video that I've created out of all of them. But if any of those concerns resonate with you in any way, it could be worth looking at how you use language and how you relate to the places that are around you, and trying to encourage more of a human aspect rather than an optimized machinery-based effort towards the same places. I hope that makes sense, but it's so difficult to summarize down this particular book. But this is non-places. It is also an introduction to Supermodernity, which is a video that I'll explain. A topic I'll explain another time in another video. For now, what I will do is I will move on to something which is much more practical, which is ACT made simple, acceptance and commitment therapy. Wonderful set of ideas, and we're very quickly getting towards the end of this playlist as well. So I'll see you over on the next one.